Welcome to another chilling tale. If you're a fan of scary stories and aren't afraid to face the unknown, leave a like now, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss any of our videos. And of course, share your thoughts in the comments. I've always worked as a janitor in schools. I enjoy the silence of the nights and the solitude that comes with the job. But of all the schools I've worked at, none has ever made me feel as uneasy as the current one. It's an old building, over 80 years old, full of long hallways, windows that creak in the wind, and a heavy atmosphere. When I signed the contract, I was warned. The third floor is off limits. They never explained why. At first, I didn't question it. My shift starts at 7 p.m. and ends at 3 a.m., and there's plenty of work on the first 2 floors to keep me busy. But as the months went by, I started hearing stories from teachers and students. They said the third floor had been closed off decades ago after a fire killed a teacher and several children during a class. I thought it was just a legend meant to scare newcomers. Until one night, everything changed. It was close to midnight, and I was finishing my rounds on the second floor. The school was completely silent, except for the occasional static from my radio. That's when I heard something that froze me in place. Laughter. Children's laughter. I looked around but saw nothing. Then I realized the sound was coming from above me. From the third floor, my heart started pounding. Who could possibly be up there? I grabbed my flashlight and began climbing the stairs to the forbidden floor. The laughter stopped the moment I reached the last step. The silence was so oppressive I could almost hear my heartbeat. My flashlight illuminated the hallway, covered in dust and cobwebs. The classrooms were empty, or so they should have been. But one of them, at the end of the hall, had its door slightly ajar. I walked toward it, each step echoing unnaturally on the aged wooden floor. When I pushed the door open, a shiver ran down my spine. The desks were all lined up neatly, as if the room was ready for a class to begin. But that made no sense. The floor had been abandoned for years. The air was freezing. On the chalkboard, something was written in crooked letters, as if by a child. "You're late, teacher." A lump formed in my throat. A strong smell of fresh chalk filled my nose. But when I looked around, there was no one there. As I turned to leave, my blood ran cold. Every desk was now occupied. Children, pale as broken porcelain dolls, sat in them with sunken, lifeless eyes. Some had burns on their faces and arms. Others bore deep scars. They were all staring at me. One of them, sitting in the front row, whispered something in a voice that seemed to echo from a deep, hollow place. "Are you ready to teach us, teacher?" My flashlight flickered, and when it steadied, the children were standing around me, their eyes now completely black. I ran like I've never run before. I stumbled down the stairs, nearly falling, and didn't stop until I was outside the school. I quit the next day and never went back. Sometimes, I still wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that I'm being watched. And in my head, I hear the same phrase over and over. "You're late, teacher." I'm one of those people who always leaves everything until the last minute. That night, I was in the school library, finishing a project that was due the next day. It was late, almost 10 p.m., and the silence was absolute. The librarian had already left, but for some reason, the door was unlocked, so I decided to take advantage of the opportunity and finish everything. When I finally closed my laptop and packed my things, I realized I was alone, completely alone. All the lights on the floor had already been turned off, and the only sound was the echo of my footsteps as I walked down the stairs. When I reached the main hallway, I noticed something odd. Everything was dark except for one single room at the end of the corridor. The light inside was on, and I could see through the crack in the door that someone was inside. I thought it might be the janitor or a teacher who had forgotten to lock up. As I approached, I felt an inexplicable discomfort. There was no sound coming from the room, but a feeling of weight seemed to increase with every step. I stopped in front of the door and peeked through the crack. My eyes widened. Inside, all of my classmates were sitting at their desks, lined up as if waiting for something. But something was wrong. They weren't moving. They weren't blinking. They were just staring at the blackboard. I knew this didn't make sense. They had all left hours ago, and I was the last person in the school. Still, there they were in absolute silence. My heart started racing. That's when I saw what was written on the blackboard, in crooked letters made with white chalk. The class starts when she arrives. A chill ran down my spine. Instinctively, I took a step back. And it was at that moment that all their faces turned to look at me simultaneously. There's no way to describe that movement. It wasn't human. It was too fast, and their eyes were dead, empty. I felt my body freeze. Their mouths began to move, but no sound came out. It was like watching a silent film, but with an intensity that made my ears ring. I tried to run, but my legs felt glued to the ground. Then, the door to the room began to open slowly, as if inviting me in. A smell of chalk and mold flooded the hallway. A voice, low and hoarse, echoed in my head as if it were whispering right next to me. "You're late." That was enough to snap me out of my trance. I ran like I've never run before, across the dark hallway to the main exit. My hands were shaking so much that it took me a while to unlock the door and get out. When I finally managed to leave, I looked back. All the lights in the school were off, including the one in the room. The next day, I went to the principal's office to report what had happened. The principal looked at me with a strange expression and said, "Sweetheart, that's not possible. That hallway has been closed off for years." I insisted, telling her that I saw my classmates there, that the light was on, that something was wrong. She sighed and pulled a file from the drawer. It was an old, yellowed newspaper. The headline read, "Fire at School Kills 25 Students and a Teacher During Night Class." The photo showed the same room where I had seen my class. After that, I never went back to the school. But to this day, sometimes I still feel like I'm being watched, and whenever I'm alone, I have the sensation that someone whispers behind me, "You're late." It was an ordinary day at school. The math teacher had been absent, as she often was, and the principal had instructed to lock up room 12, claiming it was for maintenance. I never understood why all the secrecy, but everyone just accepted the explanation. Room 12 was, as everyone knew, at the end of the hall with an old, creaky door that always seemed to be in bad shape but was never fixed. That afternoon, I was in a rush to leave. When I got to the locker room, I realized I had left my pencil case with all my materials in room 12. I knew the school was already closing, but something made me decide to go back and get it. My mind was full of random thoughts, and before I realized it, I was back in the empty hall with the lights turned off except for the dim light coming from the back. The door to room 12 was ajar. Something immediately bothered me, but I'm not the type to get scared easily, so I pushed the door open and entered. The smell hit me immediately, something sweet and nauseating, like a mix of mold and old perfume. The room was completely different from what I remembered. The desks were turned toward the wall, all arranged strangely, and there was no longer the usual classroom feeling. It was as if the place was waiting for something. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I went to where I knew I had left my pencil case. When I crouched to grab it, the smell grew stronger, and a strange feeling overtook me. Before I could stand up, I heard a whisper, a clear, direct whisper, as if someone was right next to me, in my ear. "You weren't supposed to be here." I froze. I didn't turn immediately, but I began to look around. The room was empty, no one there, not even the janitor. I was alone. My heart began to race, and a sense of panic took over me. The air felt heavier, and the smell was unbearable. When I tried to stand up quickly, a dull pain in my head almost made me fall, as if the room was pressing against me. I knew I had to get out of there, but before I could take more than 2 steps toward the door, I heard the sound of a key turning. What was that? I looked back and saw the door slowly closing. I couldn't move. When I finally reacted and ran toward the door, it slammed shut by itself, locking me inside. The sound of the key turning in the lock made my stomach churn. I stood there, screaming and banging on the door, but nothing happened. Time seemed to stop. Each thud against the door echoed off the walls of the room, and the smell was becoming unbearable. It felt as if the walls were closing in on me, tightening my breath. And suddenly, I heard the whisper again, but this time, it was louder and clearer. "Now you're one of us." I didn't know what to do anymore. The room seemed to come alive, as if it were swallowing me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened. No one was there, just the room as if nothing had happened. I ran out, not looking back. The clock on the wall showed that only a few minutes had passed, but to me, it felt like the entire night had been consumed. I never went back to room 12. When I asked the other students about it, they all said the same thing. No one goes there. They say it's closed for maintenance. But somewhere in the shadows, something tells me it's not maintenance they're doing. My school always had something strange about it. Maybe it was the age of the building or the way the hallways would get dark even during the day. But until then, I never really paid much attention to it. That week, I was tasked with organizing the books in the library after hours. It was an extra activity to earn points, and I thought it would be easy. The library was large, full of old and creaky bookshelves, but it was usually deserted after classes. That afternoon, the silence was absolute. I was alone, focused on putting books on the shelves, when I heard it. A faint rustling, as if someone were quickly flipping through pages. I stopped. I looked around, but saw no one. It must have been the wind, I thought, trying to calm myself. But the sound continued, louder this time, coming from one of the tables in the corner. My heart began to race. I walked toward it, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. When I got there, I saw a book open on the floor, right in the middle of the room. I didn't remember placing it there. The cover was thick, brown, and looked very old. As I bent down to pick it up, a shiver ran down my spine. The book was a yearbook, dated 1978. Curious, I flipped through the pages. It was a book full of photos of old classes, with students lined up, smiling. But something was strange. The photos seemed worn, with faces blurred and some parts burned, as if someone had tried to erase certain students. It was when I turned a page that my heart stopped. In the class photo for that year, I saw my own face. There I was, in the middle of the back row, staring directly at the camera. My clothes were different, something I would never wear, but it was definitely me. I looked at the bottom of the photo, where the students' names were listed, and there it was, my full name. My throat went dry, but what really chilled me was the inscription just below my name. Missing? I started to shake. How was this possible? The yearbook was from 1978, decades before I was even born. My brain struggled to find a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. As I tried to understand what was happening, I felt a change in the atmosphere. The air grew heavy, as if the room itself was pressing against me. The sound of pages turning started again, but this time, it seemed to come from all directions. I slammed the yearbook shut and tried to put it back on the table. But before I could leave, a faint light began to flicker in the corner of the library. When I looked, I saw something that took my breath away. A figure was standing between the shelves. It was tall, cloaked in shadows, and seemed to be watching me. It had no face, only a dark void where the eyes should be. I wanted to run, but my legs were frozen. The figure began to slowly move toward me, each step accompanied by the sound of pages turning. Finally, I gathered enough strength and ran. I crossed the library, bumped into tables, and almost fell before reaching the door. When I turned to look, the room's light was off, and the yearbook was back on the floor, open to the same page. I never entered the library again. I told a few friends what happened, but no one believed me. I researched the school and found something even more disturbing. In 1978, a group of students mysteriously disappeared. They were never found. And since then, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that I'm being watched. The last time this happened, I found something under my bed. A torn page from a yearbook. The photo was from the 1978 class. And there I was, staring directly at the camera.